The courtroom didn't feel like it was holding a trial anymore. It felt like it was holding its breath. The last day had arrived. No more witnesses, no more exhibits, just closing arguments. And the man himself, Diddy Combs, sat perfectly still at the defense table, staring straight ahead, eyes unfocused, as if he were already hearing something the rest of the room hadn't caught up to yet. He wasn't wearing a flashy suit, no designer sunglasses, no polished watch glinting under the fluorescent lights, just a simple black blazer, an open collar, and a face that had clearly not slept. The room was cold, unnaturally silent. No press were allowed inside, but the outside world was pressing in like thunder on the other side of a glass wall. The judge entered with gravity in his steps. He wasn't just presiding over a trial anymore. He was managing the collapse of a narrative that had once seemed untouchable. The jury sat rigid. Most had their hands folded. Some avoided eye contact with the defendant entirely if you were still watching him intensely. The prosecution rose first. Their voice didn't rise. Their delivery wasn't dramatic. It didn't have to be. What they laid out was a story told piece by piece over the course of weeks. Financial records, sealed rooms, encrypted messages, loyalty bought and sold, and a silence paid for in fear. "You've heard everything," the prosecutor said calmly. "Now ask yourself, does a man build an empire like that and never see what it's built on?" They sat down. The defense followed. Diddy's attorney didn't argue innocence. Instead, he painted a picture of complexity, of pressure, of a man pulled into storms of his own making. Yes, but also shaped by a system that rewards ruthlessness. "He's not perfect," the attorney said. "But imperfection isn't guilt, and true guilt requires more than just suspicion. It requires proof." And then it happened. Sean Combs stood, not rushed, not shaky, just certain, like this moment that had already played itself out in his head 1,000 times before. His lawyer leaned toward him quickly, whispering, clearly trying to stop him. Diddy raised one hand and said something quietly. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Combs, are you requesting to speak?" Diddy looked up. "Yes, Your Honor, I am." The judge glanced to both legal teams. "This is highly unorthodox, but I'll allow it. This is your moment. Use it wisely. Before we dive deeper into this unforgettable video, make sure to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon. That way you'll never miss any new coming videos like this. Now let's get back to it." He walked slowly to the center of the courtroom, toward the podium. His footsteps echoed off the walls. He placed his hands on the wood, leaned forward slightly, and looked at the judge, then the jury, then the gallery behind them. For a moment, he just breathed. No one knew what he was going to say, but everyone knew that whatever it was, it would be the kind of thing that doesn't stay in a courtroom. It would be something people talked about for years, something they would quote, replay, analyze, and wonder whether it was truth or strategy. And yet in that moment, there was no performance in him, no rehearsed charisma, no charm, just a man about to speak his truth, or at least the version of it that he couldn't run from anymore. He stood there for a long moment without saying a word, not out of hesitation, but control. Sean Combs was no stranger to rooms watching him. But this wasn't a stage, and these weren't fans. These were jurors, a judge, a gallery full of quiet eyes that had seen pieces of him that were never meant to be seen. And yet he didn't flinch. "I want to speak not as a mogul, not as an icon, not as someone you've seen in interviews or headlines," he said, voice low, steady. "I want to speak as the man who's lived in silence longer than most people realize." The courtroom stayed perfectly still, no coughs, no shifting in seats, just focus. Diddy's voice wasn't the kind they'd heard on albums. It was deeper, worn, stripped. "I've built my name on control. That's not just branding, it's the truth. Control of my narrative, my image, my business, even the people around me. I told myself it was necessary, that it was survival, that when you grow up with nothing, you have to make sure no one ever takes what you built. And somewhere along the line, I stopped asking myself whether I was right. I only asked if I was untouchable." He looked down for a second, not in shame, but like he was walking back through the rooms in his mind. "I've heard what's been said in this courtroom. Some of it true, some of it exaggerated, and some of it darker than even I expected would surface. But what matters to me now isn't what's proven, it's what I know. I know that power without accountability rots the soul. I know I let fear speak louder than conscience. I know I allowed people to be hurt under the shelter of my silence." One juror leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes locked on him. "I'm not asking this court for forgiveness," he continued. "I know how that sounds, like I'm trying to rewrite the script of my life at the 11th hour. I'm not. I've had years, decades of being protected by lawyers, teams, handlers, PR spin, damage control. They built me walls. I paid them to, and now I'm standing here realizing I was the one hiding behind them." He took a breath, long, shaky. "There was a time when I convinced myself that what I did was necessary, business, survival. Sometimes I thought, if I don't do it, someone else will. But I see now what starts as ambition becomes something else when you stop looking people in the eyes. I stopped seeing faces. I saw threats or opportunities, never people. The judge watched closely. His pen sat still over the paper in front of him. Diddy's tone didn't rise, but it hit harder with every sentence. There are people who will never speak in this room. People who were silenced not by money, not even by threats, but by history. People whose truth I buried under success, distractions, payouts, and the shame of that sits with me. He gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles white. So no, I'm not here to beg, and I'm not here to play the victim. I'm here to say this plainly. I failed, as a man, as a leader, as someone who once promised himself he'd be different. In that moment, the courtroom wasn't just listening, it was witnessing. Not an admission of every count, not a legal confession, but a fracture, a letting go of something heavy and carefully hidden, and there was no taking it back. I didn't come from a world that teaches you how to deal with guilt, he continued, eyes locked on the jury. No, where I came from, you learn. To survive, you learn to move, to climb. You don't stop, you don't look back. And if something hurts, you bury it deep. That's the rule. He stepped slightly away from the podium, not in dramatics, but like his thoughts were pulling him forward. Survival turned into success, and success turned into armor. I walked through rooms where no one said no to me, where people nodded before I finished a sentence. That kind of power, it doesn't just corrupt, it blinds you. You start thinking you're making smart decisions when really you're just silencing consequences. He turned toward the judge. Now, I built a business, a brand, a movement. I gave people jobs, created opportunities. But none of that excuses the people I failed behind closed doors, the assistants I overworked, the artists I underpaid, the people I promised protection and then abandoned when they became inconvenient. The gallery shifted. Some of them had been those people or knew someone who had. You know what hurts the most, he said, voice tightening. Not the fall, not the headlines, not even this courtroom. What hurts the most is realizing that some of the people I cared about stopped looking at me like I was human, and maybe I deserve that because I stopped treating them like they were. He looked back to the jury. I used to think everything could be fixed, that money could erase anything, that if I kept giving enough, building enough, performing enough, nobody would ever see what I kept buried. But this trial, this room, it made me look. And I hate what I saw. His hands relaxed on the edge of the podium now, his voice softer, but every word hit like a confession wrapped in stone. I'm not the man I pretended to be. I'm not a monster either, but somewhere in between those extremes is the version of me that I'm trying to own right now. The one who didn't stop things he should have. The one who let fear, ego, and legacy make decisions that should have come from the heart. He glanced at the ceiling, then slowly backed down. I used to think that silence was strength, that showing weakness would get you killed or at least cancelled. But silence cost me more than I realized. It didn't just hurt others, it hollowed me out, bit by bit. The courtroom had stopped feeling like a room. It felt like a mirror, and everyone inside was staring into it. I'm not here to ask you to ignore the facts, he said. You've seen them, you've heard the testimonies. I'm not here to erase that. I'm here because I finally understand something I should have learned a long time ago. That truth doesn't always scream, sometimes it just waits for a man to get tired of lying to himself. He stepped back, took a breath, and for a moment, just a flicker, you could see the boy he used to be, not the mogul, not the boss, just a man standing in front of a silence that finally spoke back. He turned slightly toward the gallery now, toward the people in the back rows, some of them familiar, others complete strangers. The tension in their faces was undeniable. This wasn't the Diddy they had known on magazine covers, stage lights, or acceptance speeches. This wasn't the man who'd filled arenas. This was someone else entirely. I see people in this room who knew me before the fame, he said quietly. Back when I was hustling mixtapes out of the trunk, back when a studio session was the only shot I had at a better life. You remember that hunger, that fear, that fire? I still carry it. But somewhere along the way, I started feeding the wrong fire. His words hung heavy, each one falling harder than the last. There were moments, private ones, small ones that should have been the warning signs. I snapped at people who were loyal to me. I cut off voices that told me things I didn't want to hear. I prioritized my name over my responsibility. And even when I knew something wasn't right, I said nothing. He looked at the judge again. I know this court can only see what's on paper. I understand that the facts, the evidence, the testimonies, you've got to work within the law. But I need to say this, for the record, for myself, even if it doesn't change anything legally. He took another step, his voice firmer now, not louder, but more grounded. I hurt people, not always with my hands, not always with direct orders, but with power, with silence, with permission I never should have given. And I take full responsibility for the environment I allowed to exist around me. One of the jury members leaned forward again, elbows on the bench, watching him with something that resembled disbelief or maybe awe. People ask why I didn't speak sooner, why I let it go on, and the answer's ugly. Because I could, because I thought I had time to clean it up, to fix it behind the scenes, to make a few calls and bury the noise. But that noise, it became a scream. and now I hear it every time I close my eyes." He paused, almost as if checking to see if the room was still with him. It was, and let me tell you something that nobody prepares you for. When you spend your whole life building walls to keep the world out, those walls don't just protect youth, they trap you. And I built mine too high, for too long, until I couldn't see the difference between survival and sabotage. He rubbed his hands together briefly, nervous energy escaping the only way it could. "I can't undo what's been done. I can't rewind time, but I can stop lying about who I've been, and I can start telling the truth, even if it cost me everything." His voice dropped lower, just above a whisper, "Because if I walk out of here still pretending, then this whole trial meant nothing. The evidence, the victims, the pain. It's all wasted if I leave here with the same mask I walked in wearing." A quiet gasp came from the far corner. Someone couldn't hold it back anymore. He didn't turn to look. "I'm not here for redemption. I'm here for reckoning, for truth. Not just for you to judge me, but for me to finally judge myself." He stepped back from the podium, breathing heavily now. And as he stood there, chest rising and falling, the room didn't see a billionaire or a brand or a headline. They saw a man. And for the first time, maybe ever, he looked ready to face the weight of everything he'd spent his life running from. He stood there for a moment longer, eyes closed, not like he was searching for words, but like he was finally allowing the silence to settle over him, letting it speak louder than the sound of his own voice. When he opened his eyes again, he looked directly at the jury, and for the first time, he smiled. Not the grin of a performer, not the calculated smile of a man in control, but something smaller, human, worn. "You've probably asked yourselves, who is this man really?" he said, his voice quieter now. "After everything you've heard, all the names, the accounts, the secrets you're trying to piece together, what's real? I don't blame you. I've blurred that line myself more times than I can count." He stepped slightly away from the podium, walking slowly to the center of the room. The judge didn't stop him. The marshals didn't move. They just watched. "I used to believe that being great meant never looking weak, that showing emotion meant you'd lose the room, lose the deal, lose your edge. So I built this image, invincible, unsacable. I made sure every headline kept that story alive. Every brand deal, every hit record, every red carpet was part of it." He paused, his hands relaxed at his sides. "But behind all of that, I was hiding things. Things that were messy, things I didn't want to answer for, the deals that were made in the dark, the voices I ignored, the people I let fall so I could keep climbing." He turned to the gallery now, scanning the back rows, locking eyes with no one and everyone at once. "And some of you in this room you knew. You saw the warning signs. You told me to slow down, to clean up, to take responsibility. But I pushed you out. I told myself you didn't understand the pressure I was under, the weight I was carrying. Truth is, I just didn't want to be seen. Not really, not by people who knew who I used to be before all this." The courtroom didn't move. No one shifted. The stillness was absolute. "Now I stand here," he continued, his voice trembling slightly, "not asking for a reset, not asking for a second chance, but asking to be remembered for more than the empire. Because behind the businesses, the music, the press, there's a man who got lost in his own myth." His lawyer looked down at the defense table, not writing, not whispering, just listening. "I wish I could go back and tell the younger version of me that power is an armor, its weight. That every time you silence someone, you carry their silence like a stone in your chest. And now I'm full of stones." He took a long breath. "I don't know what you'll decide after this. I'm not here to sway your verdict. I don't expect mercy, but I do want the truth on the record, not the polished one, not the publicist-approved version. Just this me, standing in front of you saying I've done wrong, I've hurt people, and I'm no longer willing to pretend I didn't." He stepped back to the podium one final time. "I used to think I could outtalk the truth. Now I know the truth doesn't care how rich you are, how famous, how powerful. It waits quietly, and when it finally shows up, there's nowhere to hide." He looked down, and with that he said, "I'm done." He didn't look up again. He didn't need to. The silence that followed wasn't like the others. It didn't just fill the room. It pressed against the skin, lingered in the chest, made it hard to breathe. The judge didn't speak. The court reporter sat frozen, her fingers hovering over the keys. The marshals didn't shift. The jury didn't blink. No one moved. Sean Combs stepped back from the podium and returned to his seat slowly, deliberately. Every step felt like it was carved in stone. He didn't look at anyone, not his lawyer, not the gallery, not the jurors. When he sat, he folded his hands in his lap, leaned forward slightly, and stared at the floor like he was finally sitting in the wreckage he'd spent years building. His attorney glanced at him with a look that was half pride, half dread, because in legal terms that speech could have been a landmine, but in human terms it was a damn earthquake. The judge finally shifted in his seat and cleared his throat. "Let the record show the defendant has made a voluntary, unscripted statement to the court. It will be entered into the case log in full." And still no one moved, because everyone understood something. Now, the trial might have begun as a battle, of evidence, of strategy, of legal maneuvering, but it had evolved into something else entirely. It had become a public confrontation with identity, a war between the myth and the man who created it. The jury didn't even glance at each other. They just sat there stunned, like they were no longer simply deciding a verdict but witnessing a transformation. From behind the gallery someone exhaled audibly. It sounded like they'd been holding their breath for hours. And yet, even with the confession, no formal plea had changed. Legally, everything still hung in limbo. Emotionally, though, the walls had cracked wide open. The prosecutor stood as if unsure whether to say anything at all. She looked over at Diddy, then back to the judge. "Your Honor, the prosecution will forego any further comment at this time," she said. "That never happens." The defense made no motion, no rebuttal, just silence. And maybe that silence was the smartest thing they'd done in weeks. Outside the courtroom, the world didn't know yet. Phones were locked away. Reporters boxed out. But inside, the people who'd been sitting in those benches every day, watching each revelation drop like a hammer, knew what they'd just seen. It wasn't spin. It wasn't PR. It was something so rare it didn't even feel real, a man telling the truth because there was nothing left to protect. Diddy sat motionless as the judge declared the court in recess. Jurors were dismissed to a private lounge. Attorneys left the room in pairs, whispering about strategy and fallout. The marshals kept their distance but didn't leave his side, and he didn't move. Because when you finally take off the mask, sometimes the hardest part is figuring out who's still underneath it. For the first time in the entire trial, Sean Combs wasn't trying to control the room. He was trying to feel what it meant to be free of the performance. And the room finally understood it. After the recess was called, the courtroom didn't empty like usual. People lingered, standing quietly, gathering papers, whispering without sound. It was as if the entire space had turned sacred. Something had happened in that room that none of them could fully name yet. No camera had captured it. No flashbulb had lit it. But they'd all felt it. Sean Combs remained seated at the defense table, elbows on his knees, head lowered, hands clasped loosely, like a man not waiting for judgment but letting it arrive on its own time. His attorney stood a few steps away, talking to a clerk, barely glancing in his direction. There was nothing to say to him. Not anymore. Because when a client says that much, no amount of lawyering is going to redirect the course of what's coming next. Across the room, a marshal received a call on a secure earpiece. A short nod followed. Then quietly, he walked over and whispered something to the judge. The judge's expression didn't change, but a new stillness entered his posture. "Mr. Combs," he said, voice calm but with a sudden edge, "I've just been informed that federal prosecutors have filed an emergency motion based on elements mentioned in your statement today. We will hold this court in suspension pending review. You are to remain in custody during this process." No shock rippled through the room, just stillness. Diddy didn't react. No twitch, no breath, no expression. As if he'd already known this was coming. Maybe even counted on it. Outside the courtroom, news was breaking like waves against the walls. Social media was catching whispers. Journalists were posting vague lines. Courtroom chaos after Combs' surprise confession. Federal motion filed. New charges incoming. But inside, none of that mattered. There were no phones, no headlines, just truth unfolding like smoke and still air. The jury was escorted out through a private exit. Some looked over their shoulders. One of them, middle-aged, glasses, jacket still draped across her arm, wiped at her eyes with the sleeve. They weren't just leaving a courtroom. They were leaving the end of a man's performance, the collapse of his armor. Back inside, the judge stood slowly. "In all my years," he said, voice quiet, "I have never seen a defendant take that risk. You've done something unusual today, Mr. Combs, and regardless of outcome, this moment will not be forgotten." Diddy raised his head for the first time since the recess began. He didn't speak. He just nodded once. The marshal stepped closer, not aggressive, not hostile, just necessary. One placed a hand lightly on his shoulder and motioned toward the side door. No cuffs, no shackles, just presence. He stood, walked toward the door like he'd done it before, and maybe he had, metaphorically, 1,000 times. But this time it was different. This time there was no script left to follow, no stage lights, no applause, only the sound of the heavy courtroom door closing behind him, and the echo of words the world wasn't supposed to hear but now could never forget. In the hallway outside the courtroom, the silence didn't follow him, it shattered. As soon as the door closed behind Sean Combs, the air snapped alive. Reporters surged forward from every direction. Marshals locked down the perimeter. Attorneys pushed past one another with eyes wide and jaws tight. Phones that had been surrendered for days were now in hand again, lighting up with breaking headlines and social media tremors. The storm had officially begun, but Sean didn't look left or right. He walked like a man who had just left something behind forever, something heavy, something alive. The cameras waiting outside weren't allowed inside the courtroom, but they didn't need footage. The word was already out. His statement had reached the press within minutes, recreated through courtroom sources, legal clerks, even sketch summaries, from witnesses who couldn't forget the words if they tried. "I'm not the man I pretended to be. I built walls and lived behind them. I stopped seeing people. Silence hollowed me out." Those quotes were everywhere: television tickers, live streams, podcast headlines. This wasn't just a celebrity moment, it was a cultural fault line. Something that cracked open. It wasn't just Diddy's image, it was the entire idea of who he had been for the last 30 years. By the time the elevator opened to take him down to federal holding, the U.S. Marshals escorting him weren't just watching for danger. They were guarding the weight of what he had done. This wasn't a man being dragged to prison. This was a man being carried by his own truth. Inside the elevator, no one spoke. Diddy leaned against the wall, eyes closed, not asleep, not defeated, just still, maybe for the first time in his life. Meanwhile, back in the courtroom, the judge was in chambers with both legal teams. No press, no recorders, but what leaked out just 2 hours later changed everything. The prosecution had submitted a sealed file, one they'd been holding back, unsure if it would be admissible. The contents were confirmed only because Diddy himself, in his final statement, acknowledged the events described inside. What had been considered circumstantial was now personal testimony, self-admission. The file included names, locations, a security audio clip allegedly recorded within the infamous Grey Room. It wasn't the entire puzzle, but it was enough to flip the case on its head. One insider described the reaction in chambers in 2 words: complete shock. The federal court, within 4 hours, filed for suspension of the current trial and a transfer of jurisdiction for expanded prosecution. This wasn't just about one trial anymore, it was turning into something larger, cross-agency, cross-border, criminal and civil. The walls weren't just closing in, they were already falling, and the man at the center of it, he had removed the last barrier himself. By the time the official statement from the Department of Justice was posted that evening, confirming a transition to federal custody for broader investigation, the headlines had stopped being about music, fame, or legacy. They were about truth, about silence, and about the moment Sean Combs stood in a courtroom, looked the justice system in the eye, and chose, for once, not to run. That was the moment the courtroom transformed from a stage into a reckoning, and that was the moment the world stopped calling him untouchable. By morning, the world was already reshaped. News anchors sat behind trembling voices reading updates they never thought they'd speak. Talk shows abandoned scheduled interviews to dissect every line from Diddy's final courtroom statement. Online influencers, musicians, former collaborators, all of them were either silent or stunned. Some deleted old posts, others issued cryptic responses, a few went live, visibly shaken, saying they didn't know it was this deep. But inside federal custody, away from the noise, Diddy sat alone in a white room with no windows, a holding cell meant for high-profile defendants under protective status. The world outside had turned him into a symbol overnight of reckoning, of power crashing into truth. But in that room, none of that mattered. There were no phones, no handlers, no stylists, no music, just concrete, fluorescent light, and the sound of his own breath. For the first time in decades, he was off the grid. Not because he wanted to be, but because the story had outgrown him. In Washington, D.C., a joint task force was already forming, not because of pressure from media, but because Diddy's confession had unlocked something prosecutors had been chasing for years. His admission hadn't named every name, hadn't confirmed every detail, but it had connected dots that had previously been scattered across sealed documents, confidential informants, and offshore audits. The investigation was now officially labeled interstate criminal conspiracy, with obstruction of justice, intimidation, and fraudulent enterprise structuring. It wasn't just about what he did, it was about who helped, and that was the part nobody in the entertainment world wanted to talk about, because if Diddy fell, if his words cracked the seal on years of unspoken backroom alliances, who else would be dragged down with him? His empire wasn't just built on business, it was built on connections, endorsements, labels, lawyers, managers, people who knew enough to stay quiet until now. Inside the cell, when an agent brought him a document to sign, standard intake form, Diddy looked up and said, "Only one thing. Is this the part where I finally stop pretending?" The agent didn't answer. He didn't have to. Back in New York, the courtroom remained locked, no hearings scheduled, no verdict read. The trial had been paused indefinitely, and yet in the public's mind it had already ended, not with sentencing, but with surrender. People began replaying old clips, Diddy walking red carpets, giving motivational speeches, celebrating wins with champagne and staged humility. Those moments now looked different, filtered through the lens of confession. Every polished quote from the past sounded like foreshadowing. Every smirk looked heavier, and the courtroom sketch from that final day, Diddy standing alone, one hand on the podium, eyes dark but open, was already being shared as an image that would outlive the trial itself. The empire hadn't just cracked, it had spoken, and the silence that followed was louder than anything he'd ever put on a record. The headlines faded, but the echo didn't. Weeks passed. The courtroom remained closed. Legal motions stacked up behind sealed doors. Federal investigators issued subpoenas, launched audits, traced names Diddy had never said aloud but everyone now suspected were woven deep into his story. There was no verdict, but there didn't need to be, because the moment he spoke, unfiltered, unscripted, unprotected, he gave the world something the system rarely offers: a moment of raw, uncontainable truth. Not the kind found in closing arguments or grand jury statements, but the kind that lives in the space after a man says, "I failed." He didn't try to spin it. He didn't claim redemption. He didn't pull anyone else into the fire. He just stood in the middle of the wreckage and admitted it was partly his design. And that honesty, however incomplete, however strategically timed, was enough to change how an entire generation looked at him. The music didn't disappear. The businesses didn't collapse overnight. But the illusion did. The aura of invincibility that had hovered over Sean Combs since his rise was gone. What remained wasn't a fall from grace. It was a dismantling of the myth, and it made space for something else: accountability. In a world where apologies are often hollow and statements come pre-packaged by lawyers and PR teams, his words cut through like a blade. Not because they were perfect, but because they were real. And once something real hits the air, it can't be taken back. In the months that followed, Diddy remained under federal custody, awaiting decisions that would unfold far beyond that courtroom. In Manhattan, the spotlight shifted to others, names slowly circling the edges of his empire. But his story, the way it unraveled, the way it cracked open the silence, stayed with everyone who watched it happen. There were no more public appearances, no social media posts, no vague press releases or half-hearted apologies typed out by assistants, just silence. And that silence became the message. For years, Sean Combs had moved the world with noise beats, performances, declarations of dominance. But in the end, it was the quiet that defined him. The moment he stopped hiding, the moment he stood alone, not with power but with truth. It didn't clear his name. It didn't erase the damage. But it did something rare. It made people listen, not to his music, not to his brand, but to the cost of building a kingdom on silence. The trial may be over. The courtrooms may go quiet. But the words he spoke, raw, unpolished, final, will live longer than the verdict ever will.